What's up, guys? In today's video, I'm going to be teaching you how to build a farmhouse trestle table. Just as a disclaimer, this is not my design. I got this idea from Third Coast Craftsman, and I'd been looking for a trestle table for a while to build. And his shape and the way that he built it just really appealed to me, so I decided I wanted to build one of my own. So starting this video off, I began using the stock that I was given by a friend. The stock is very narrow and it's only 1.75 inches thick by 2 inches wide. The stock has a slight edge on it, and so I begin by ripping that slight edge off, leaving me with the 2-inch stock. Then it leaves me with these square boards that are about 2 inches by 1.75 inch thick. I start off by marking out all of my legs and all of the center posts, and I cut them all to length. I speed up this process a little bit just so you guys don't have to see every single cut that I make. Then I begin cutting the stretcher boards for the top of the table. After all the cuts are made, everything is ready to be glued up. Before gluing, I decide that I need to joint all these boards down to make sure they go together nice and flush. And before that, I scribble a bunch of lines on there to make sure I know what sides need to be jointed down. This will ensure that you make sure that all the sides get jointed before you actually glue it up. Then I come over to the jointer and I set my jointer to only take off a 32nd of an inch each pass that I make. And these boards are fairly square already after my cuts, so 1 or 2 passes should suffice. Once all my boards are all jointed down, I'm ready to glue all of them up. Since the middle post, the center posts, and the bottom of the legs are going to be 4 pieces glued together, I only glue 2 pieces together at once. And this will ensure that all the boards are flat up against each other and they're all flush, and that'll make for less work later on. As you can see here, I'm using a lot of clamps for some of my glue ups, and this just goes to show that you can never have too many clamps. All of the best woodworkers that I've ever known and talked to have always said the very same thing, that you can never have too many clamps. And for this project specifically, I used almost all of my clamps just to make sure that everything was 100% flush and ready to go. Then I glue up the main table stretcher. This is the piece that will be stretching from one leg to the other, connecting them both together. Here I continue to glue up the center posts and all of the feet, as well as the tops of the legs. Throughout the whole gluing process, I had to come back and glue for about 5 days straight because I didn't have enough clamps for everything that needed to be glued together. Now I begin to glue up the top supports. These are the 2 supports that will stretch across the top of the legs and hold them together. For any of the main components of the table, I like to use bar clamps to tighten these up together because they hold a lot tighter and they put a lot more pressure, holding the joint a lot tighter instead of squeeze clamps. I use squeeze clamps occasionally, but I try not to. Here I begin gluing up the main braces of the table. Each one of these is only 2 pieces, but that also makes up for the 16 pieces that I used in total, making 8 braces. Now I begin face gluing the main posts together. I'll later come back and hand plane all the remaining glue off, as well as sanding it down. Next, I take my center post and I clamp it down and I mark out where I want all my tenons. I then take a fence and I use a circular saw to cut directly across the line where my tenons will be. I make a bunch of passes just to make relief cuts on both sides where the tenons are going to wind up. After I make my runs with the circular saw, I take a pole saw and I cut just the outside flap off. The reasoning for this is so I don't chip anything when I come back with a hammer and I just hit the remaining pieces out easily. After that, I clean it up with a chisel. There's many ways to do these tenons, but this is one of my favorite ways. It goes very fast and it's usually very effective and strong. Then I come back and I begin to cut all of my supports to length. I glued them up about a ½ inch longer than they needed to be, just to make sure that I would know that my tenons would be as long as they needed to be. I then sit down and I mark out everything of where I want my tenons and the angles that I want them at. All I use for this is a combination square. All the braces will be at an exact 45-degree angle, so the tenons fit in nice and perfect. After I have everything marked out, I come over to the bandsaw and I cut it out. Most of my equipment I use, since I work in a small shop, is all shopsmith equipment that can be changed over to anything else. After the main parts of the tenon are cut out completely, I then mark out with my combination square where I will be cutting next. I then take my pole saw and I cut out the remaining parts of the tenon. For this project, I try to use as many hand tools as I can, such as the pole saw and chisels and hand planes, just to show that you don't need large equipment to do all of this. You can just use simple hand tools. After all my tenons are finally cut on the braces, I come and I mark out the tenons on the main stretcher of the table. I use my pole saw to do all this work. Once all of my tenons are finally cut, I come over to my shopsmith drill press and I start drilling out all the mortises. I find drill pressing all the mortises and then coming back and chiseling them all out is the fastest and most effective way for me to do these mortises. I select the biggest drill bit I can for the mortise hole that I'm drilling to drill out the maximum amount that I can, so I won't be left with too much to chisel later. Again, there are many ways to make these mortises. These are just the methods that I used that I found to be most helpful. Once all the mortises are finally drilled out and all the tenons are cut, I dry fit everything, putting the center post into the bottom leg, and then also hammering the top support onto the center post. All of your mortise and tenon should fit in nice and snug, and you should be able to pound them into place. After everything is dry fit together, I take all my braces and I lie them in place as if they are going into the place right now. And I mark out where the tenons lie on the center post and on the legs. Make sure that you mark out and label everything as I did here. I labeled them B and B1. You can label them numbers or letters. It doesn't matter. Just so long as you know that wherever your marks lie, that's where the tenon is going to go into the mortise. I come back to the shopsmith drill press and I begin drilling out all my mortises once again. Now I use a 3/8 inch drill bit to drill press straight through where all of the tenons are going to be into their mortises. This will be the anchor point for where a dowel will go straight through and anchor the tenon in place. I then mark and I cut out the dovetail joints on the top braces that will be fitting into the top supports of each leg. I again mark out A, B, C, and D for wherever I end up putting them into to make sure that they end up lining up perfectly once I go to fit them in place. I then clamp these each down to the top supports and I trace out where they are going to land on the top supports. I use a router to do most of the cutting and I take a couple passes and I go as far up to the line as I can. After that, I use a chisel to take out the remaining pieces. Since this joint is already dovetailed, the only necessary thing to hold it in place would be glue. Make sure that before you put the top supports on in place, they're facing inward to the table and not outward. I then make a couple detailed cuts across the top supports before I fully anchor them down, as well as the feet. Before fully committing to doweling everything together and anchoring it perfectly, I decide to dry fit everything. The reasoning for this is because then I will be taking a 3/8 drill bit and hitting it through onto the tenons to mark out where the holes will need to be drilled for the tenons. When dry fitting, ensure that everything is all tight together and the braces are exactly where you want them to be. Because before you put the 3/8 drill bit through and mark out where the dowel holes are going to be, everything needs to be 100% tight. I then come back to the drill press, and using the 3/8 drill bit, I drill a hole straight through all of the tenons of the braces. Now it's finally time to fit everything together. I use glue on all of the braces joints, and I put the feet in place first. This is the only way to do so, and considering that there's a lot of tension across the whole entire leg, you need to do this slowly and make sure to hit each side in evenly. After that, you can slowly put the dowels into place. If your holes are not aligned, then the dowel will surely just split and splinter on you, and you won't be able to get it through. I then come back and use my pole saw to cut off the remaining pieces of the dowels that are sticking out of each end. Another great tip before you stick these dowels through is I cut them to a fine point, just about 1/2 inch down, to make sure that they will enter the hole straight and they'll intersect the other hole on the other side without curving or bending or splintering on you. Now it's time to attach the center post, or the main stretcher. For this, I drilled 2 holes on each side for each side of the tenon, and I put both dowels through. I then glue the top dovetail supports and pound them into place. Now that the legs are fully glued together and doweled and solid, it's time to glue up the top. I did a lot of cutting off camera just to get all this stock down and to get all the edges off. Because keep in mind, all of the stock that I'm using is only 2 inches wide, and they all had a slight bevel on them that needed to be cut off. I can only glue 3 pieces together at once, with a max being 4 pieces that I tried one time, but I didn't like how it went together, so I just kept sticking to 3 pieces at once. And I used a hell of a lot of clamps for each glue up, so the tabletop took me about a week to glue up alone, and almost 1/2 gallon of glue. When gluing up this many pieces together, you want to ensure that you switch the annual rings as much as you can to make it so the tabletop will almost never warp or cup on you. When it came down to it, I finally used my strongest bar and pipe clamps to glue up the biggest part of the table. For a tabletop like this, I would normally use biscuits to align all the pieces, but considering my stock was so narrow, I figured glue would be strong enough. After the glue was finally dried and I took all the clamps off, I then began hand planing everything to take any high spots out of the table. After smoothing it out with the hand plane, I then hit it with 100 grit sandpaper with my belt sander as well to smooth everything out. Now I can finally mark out and cut my tenons for the breadboard ends. Each side of the breadboard ends I did a little bit differently, but the way that I found to be most effective was cutting using a router, making a few passes on the inside and the outside to make sure that there's nothing that could chip out. And then I come and I use a large chisel to chisel out the remainder. After using the chisels, I come and I use a hand plane to hand plane everything nice and smooth. I could have easily just used a jigsaw for this next step, but I decided to use a pull saw and a coping saw to cut out the remaining pieces of the tenons. This will help the breadboard ends with expansion and contraction over the years. Now that the tenons on the table are completely cut out, it's time to drill the mortises into the breadboard ends. After the groove is cut into the breadboard end, I then use a narrow tape measure to mark out where the fingers of the tenons on the tabletop will be entering the breadboard end. I then use a long spade bit to drill all of the mortises into the breadboard end. A spade bit is the only bit that I could find that would be long enough for this. This was by far the most time-consuming out of the whole project, was drilling and chiseling out the mortises for the breadboard ends. But it was all worth it in the end. I then come back and I drill my 3/8 holes into the breadboard ends where I will be anchoring the breadboard ends into the tabletop. I then dry fit the breadboard end onto the tabletop and ensure that I mark out where the dowels will lie on the tenons. This was one of the more stressful parts of building this table, was attaching the ends onto the table, but seeing how nicely they fit on in the end really made it all worth it. I then pound the dowels through the tabletop, anchoring the breadboard end onto the table. I cut the ends a tad longer than what the table was wide in order so I can just cut off the remainder instead of having it come up short. If your joints end up revealing small gaps like mine did here, I came back and I filled them with wood putty that I made out of sawdust and glue. This can easily be sanded off later on. I then begin sanding the tabletop and the table bottom with a belt sander, starting with 80 grit, and working my way all the way down to 300 grit. Once everything is sanded down to my liking, I then flip the tabletop onto the top and I flip the legs onto the bottom of the table. I then mark out and cut blocking that will be glued to underneath the tabletop and attached to the legs using dowels and glue. I'll be leaving a link in the description to Third Coast Craftsman who came up with this idea. I then do the same and I drill holes straight through the blocking, and I use my 3/8 inch drill bit to mark out where the dowels will be placed. Now that your blocking is all glued down, you can begin to put whatever stain or whatever finish you want on this table. Considering that I use mahogany, I will not be staining it with anything, as I love the natural color of mahogany. I start by applying the finish with a brush on the underside of the tabletop first, following with the legs, and then the tabletop. I was very happy with the color the polyurethane was able to bring out of the mahogany, and I couldn't have asked for better lumber to be working with. I did not begin to anchor the tabletop to the legs until it was stationed in my kitchen, where its final resting place would be. The 4 dowels that I sent through the blocking into the tabletop, I pounded through about 1/2 inch and countersunk them, so I was able to put small caps over the top. So later on, if I ever wanted to remove the tabletop and move the entire table, I could do so. This project was definitely a very humbling and challenging project to build. If you're up for it, it's very rewarding in the end. If you like this video, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next.